Hello, welcome to the Chirp YouTube channel. My name is Christy, and I am your friendly online speech language pathologist and specialist in children's communication development, which includes behavior, including challenging behavior, because behavior is a type of communication. In this new series that I am beginning today, thank you for being here, let's celebrate. We're going to talk about neurodivergence. We're going to talk about how to include neurodivergent brains in our classroom, specifically for educators, but also ministry leaders, perhaps at churches, maybe sports leaders, maybe scouts leaders, maybe swimming or gymnastics coaches. How can we plan for and successfully include and welcome children whose brains are different from other kids' brains? In some cases, it will be really obvious that something is different about a particular child because of behaviors that you might see. And some of these behaviors might be considered challenging behaviors. I will discuss dealing with challenging behaviors in an inclusion environment later in this series. To begin with, we are going to talk about strategies that we can implement in a group setting that help our kids whose brains are developing differently or who are wired up differently and are helpful to the other kids too, because some strategies are helpful to everyone. Some kids just need them a little bit more to function well. The phrase neurodivergent has become much more popular in the last few years. It's very recent because I think it is a good way to encompass a lot of different diagnoses. Families don't have to say, my child has autism, and many families do not want to label their child with a diagnosis. I have thoughts about that. My thoughts are, you need a diagnosis and a diagnosis code in order to get appropriate treatment. If you have the symptoms of a diagnosis, then you have that diagnosis, and there is no harm in using that label until it no longer applies. And I have known a good number of children who were diagnosed as having an autism spectrum disorder at the time, and then they no longer have that diagnosis at some point because they no longer have the symptoms of that diagnosis. So just because your child may be diagnosed at a young age with an autism spectrum disorder does not mean that that diagnosis will persist. So if you are a family who has a child and you're thinking, I would just like to say instead that my child doesn't think like everyone else. Yes, that's part of the diagnosis. And there are other diagnostic criteria that are important for some people to know. At the same time, I would like to say that in my programs, when I have run programs, and this has been, I have worked in preschools, I have worked in public schools, I have worked in private schools, I have worked in families' homes, but the most recent work that I've done has been with churches and in churches. And when I have run programs for developmental differences in children's ministry in churches, we have not worried about diagnosis at all. I don't need money to cover these kids in church. I don't need a diagnosis code. Therefore, it does not matter to me what the child's diagnosis is. What does matter is what goals the child is working on. I can have two children, both who have a diagnosis of an autism spectrum disorder. One is working on self-regulation and early back and forth communication skills. The other one is working on forward sentences and building relationships with peers. Same diagnosis, but very different levels of functioning and very different needs in a classroom. So the diagnosis makes much less difference to me than it would for a person who needs to bill for a certain amount of money because they're providing a service to a family. There are multiple different ways to think about whether a child needs a diagnosis or a label. But also, there are other diagnoses, of course, in the neurodivergence category. This can be a problem because anyone can include him or herself in that category just because they don't feel like everyone else. And I think we all feel not like everyone else often in our lives because we're all such unique individuals. So we need to keep all that in mind as we are going forward. But because this term has become so popular, I wanted to make sure to address it in a series that might appeal to people who are looking for a way to incorporate more types of brains in their programming. And I think most of us who are good people and who have good services to offer would really like a wider population of kids to be able to enjoy the programming that we provide. We would like to be able to provide appropriate and appealing, welcoming, fun, engaging programs for all kids, not just for kids who are developing typically. And in this series, we're going to talk about how to do that. Today's video, although this has been a long introduction because it's the first video in the series, we're going to talk about visuals. I think visuals are the most important thing for welcoming kids with developmental differences because we all are born understanding visual information before we understand auditory information. Our eyes are where we get, assuming that we are sighted people, assuming that our eyes are functioning, then what we see communicates information to us much earlier than we can understand information coming in through our ears. And you will notice this if you have been to a foreign country, if you have tried to function in a society where you do not yet understand the spoken language. There's still a sign with a picture of a train on it and an arrow. You can go in the direction of that sign and you will probably find a train. You can see a picture of a toilet and realize there's probably a toilet over there because there's a picture of a toilet. This is how it works for many of our students too. Even if they are verbal, if for any reason their self-management strategies break down, if it's too loud, if there's too many people, if they're unused to the activity they're doing, if they're learning to swim but they're scared of the water and it's a little threatening or a lot threatening, they might not be processing their auditory information as quickly as they might still be processing their visual information. And so what they see through their eyes is going to get to their brain faster and communicate better with them. That is why we need to use lots of visuals in our classroom. I am not talking about long lessons with people acting stuff out. That's not visual, even though there are visual things happening. That is mostly auditory information if the people are talking and talking. I'm talking about a visual timer. We have 5 more minutes of free time left before it's going to be time for our story time. We have 10 minutes of story time, and then it will be, my timer, this timer is actually broken. I use it for demonstrations. I do not use it in the classroom. That is why it is in my office and not a classroom. There are 10 minutes left of our story time before we have free play. And then it will be time to go home. But first, 10 minutes of story time. And then this is called a visual timer. And as the time remaining decreases, the red decreases. So obviously if we have this much red, it communicates to the child, there's a lot of this activity left. Usually I'm probably not going to use that much. If I only have this much of this activity left, we're almost done. We got to get ready for our next thing. This kind of timer is very helpful. This one's by a brand called Time Timer, and this is one of their very oldest versions. It was not as sturdy as the more recent versions, which are much better. They make all different sizes. They make a wrist one, they make a desktop one like this. They make some with a ding. This one has a bell. You can tell because it has this little thing in the bottom that you can turn on and off. But mine has been broken over many years of use. But you can also set one on a desktop and they work really well. Timers are helpful for breaking down what's involved in any particular session. But in order to communicate what's involved in any particular session, we need a schedule, a visual schedule. One way that we do this is by having pictures of each activity. You can take pictures of a different child doing that activity, or you can use a program such as Boardmaker, or there are other online programs that you can use. You can type in a word like story time, and it will pop up with some options for you to use. And then you can print those out and use them as I usually laminate. Let me give you an example here. Here's a nice little example. This is playtime. I usually cut it out. I print it on cardstock, cut it out, put it on construction paper, cut it out, laminate it with my little laminator, and then it is good to go. Usually I put Velcro on the back and then I can stick it wherever I need to. But this thing has lasted years because I prepared it that way. Maybe it's story time. This one has the Velcro. Maybe it is outside fun time. Maybe it's fun time. Or maybe we are finished and it's time to move on to the next activity. These are Boardmaker illustrations. This is the program I've used since I was first in my field many years ago, and I've kept using them because they are typically what are used in classrooms at schools. Classrooms usually have veered towards the program Boardmaker, so kids are used to these symbols. But whatever symbols you decide to use, be consistent, be as consistent as possible in your program and in other kids' programs, in the other programs your students are involved in. So if it's their school or their therapy sessions, see if you can use the same program that they're using. Sometimes if they have a speech therapist like me, if the child's involved in your program, that speech therapist will make visuals that are appropriate for your programming. So for example, I would send a visual schedule and some requesting visuals with a child to her swimming class. If swimming class was a problem for her, or if I just wanted her to be able to communicate well there, I would be willing to make those visuals and send them along. A lot of parents also have these kinds of opportunities, these kind of programs installed in their computers at home, and they can make some as well. Also, you can use pictures of items. Some of these are the same. This is a communication book, and I am coming up on doing another series on using communication visuals. So stay tuned. In fact, this might be a good time to say, hey, if you appreciate this content, subscribe, give me a thumbs up. And I plan to continue making similar content that will hopefully help you as you include neurodivergent people in your programs and in your activities. I appreciate that you're doing that, and I would like to support you. So you can support me in return so that I can do that better. Anyway, this is a communication book. It's just a small binder from the office supply store, actually probably from Amazon. And I've taken pictures of favorite activities and put them in here. You cannot just put pictures in a book and expect kids to use it to communicate. We have to teach them how to do that. And I do have a very old video series on that right there, but I will be making a new one coming up, so stay tuned. Another example of visuals. Oh, we were talking about schedules. I just dropped a bunch of visuals on the floor. What we do with schedules is we put them on the wall. So I'm just going to use these three as an example. Play, color, and then I'm going to drop that one on the ground too. I've picked them all up now. First we're going to play. Kids come in, we're going to play. Then we're going to transition to singing time. And then we're going to transition to story time. And then at the end, we're going to go to the playground and have fun on the playground. This should say playground. I'm not sure why it says fun, but it does, and we're going to go with it. When kids come in, I'm going to point to this and say, play time. Then I'm going to use my timer. I'm going to set it for 5 minutes. I cannot hold everything I am holding currently and not knock the camera over. When playtime is finished, when that 5 minutes is over, the timer is going to ring and I'm going to say, playtime is finished. Playtime is finished. I'm going to take that off of the wall. Then I'm going to point to singing time. It's time for singing. We usually had a music and movement time where we'd put on songs and we would dance and we would do the motions and we would play instruments, and it was very fun. Okay, this is our music time. The timer rang and we cleaned everything up. And now we dance. We have a lot of lights going on. We have some visuals with the dance moves. Lots of light spinners. Some of our boards are hiding under the tent today. But that's a good thing. We got someone in the swing. Whee! These are in my classrooms at church. But most preschool classrooms do this as well. Everybody has music and movement time because we learn so well through music, and we benefit from movement, but also we learn how to manage our bodies by following motions and by doing particular movements repetitively. So then singing time comes. I don't probably need to set my timer for that. I never did, because when our 3 songs were over, singing time was over, and I will say singing time is finished. It's time to find your spot for story time. And that's another one where we don't really need to keep track of that when the story time is over. Story time is finished. Time for playground. Let's line up. We're going to go outside. Playground. You will notice, as I am imitating how I would communicate in a classroom of children who have communication difficulties, I'm using short sentences. I'm using visual as the first language, and my language is supporting the visual. Time to color. Coloring time. I'm not using a huge long sentence and then just flashing up a picture. The picture is the communication. My words are the supporting, encouraging bit. My words are not the main source of communication. For many of these kids, they're going to understand what the visual is saying before they understand what I'm saying. Just like you with the picture of a toilet in Bulgaria. If you would like more information about how to use visuals in your classroom or in your program, I have a playlist there about using visuals, and you can get very well educated about that. And I highly recommend this book, Visual Strategies for Improving Communication. It's my very favorite. I think this book is the very first book I ever got after I finished graduate school, as I was actually working with kids on my own as a speech pathologist. And it has been more helpful than I can say over the years. It is really helpful. It got lots of examples, and it is easy to look through and think, where do I start? And how can I best be of help to this child? Of course, if you are not the family member, if you are a different kind of support person in this child's life, if you're a church person, if you're a sports person, then talk to the family. What are you doing at home? How are you supporting your child's communication at home? Do you have a visual schedule? Do you use visual communication book at home to help your child get her wants and needs met? What do you do to tell your child where you're going and all of that kind of thing? Ask some questions, and then ask, how can we continue that in our program here so that your child has consistency and so that your child knows how to communicate what she's used to being able to communicate at home or at school. That is just a very little slice of all the wonder that's available to you as you attempt to use visual symbols to improve communication in the students that you work with, especially the ones whose brains are wired a little differently and who think a little differently and who need a lot more visual support. I also want to say here that none of these strategies are going to be bad for any other children. In fact, most of the strategies, all of the strategies that I know of that we use for children with different diagnoses are beneficial to typically developing kids as well. Typically developing kids will usually learn even without those strategies, but they benefit with those strategies also. What child isn't going to be glad to see a visual schedule on the wall, even if a child is developing typically, but tends to be a little bit worried or a little bit anxious? Having a schedule on the wall just reminds her, don't worry, we're on track. We're in singing time. Story time is next. It's fine. Everything's fine. We're on track. It just helps everyone. I like having a visual schedule in my classroom too, because then I remember what's next. I only have 3 more things to do, and then we can do free play. And that's my favorite part because I get to interact with the kids more. Well then, once again, if you are looking forward to this series, give me a thumbs up, subscribe. I will definitely be back very soon with the next video in the series, which will also be about supporting neurodivergent kids in whatever type of environment you are in. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you soon. Bye.